Probably just a janitor who wandered in. A student whispered as the woman with the low ponytail, old gray cardigan, and quiet demeanor sat in the last row of the National Math Symposium. Professor Harrington, the proud face of the academic elite, glanced at her and smirked. A reminder to our non-specialist guests, this event is for those who truly understand mathematics. No one in that room knew that in just a few minutes the woman they laughed at would rewrite an entire research path and bring the entire math world to its feet. Sarah Mitchell eased into the creaking wooden chair, its varnish worn smooth by decades of self-important scholars. The lecture hall at Crestwood University smelled of polished oak, dusty tomes, and the acrid tang of overbrewed coffee served in flimsy paper cups. The room was a sea of tailored suits, gleaming laptops, and conference badges pinned to lapels, each proclaiming titles like PhD postdoc or fellow. The air thrummed with the low buzz of intellectual superiority, a sound Sarah felt like a pulse against her skin. Their glances were sharp, raking over her frayed gray cardigan, its cuffs threadbare from years of wear, her scuffed black flats, her face bare of makeup. She carried no sleek briefcase, only a battered leather notebook, its cover embossed with faint initials that weren't hers. A young man in a navy blazer, his badge reading Princeton grad student, leaned toward his friend, his voice slicing through the hum. "What's she doing here? Did they forget to lock the staff entrance?" His companion, a woman with a sleek chignon and diamond studs glinting in her ears, stifled a laugh behind a manicured hand. "Maybe she's here to mop up our brilliance." That cardigan straight from Goodwill's clearance bin. Sarah's hands rested in her lap, fingers tracing the notebook's worn edge, her posture straight despite the weight of their scorn. Another voice joined the fray, a postdoctoral researcher with a clipped British accent, his silk tie knotted tightly, his badge marking him as Cambridge Fellow. "Honestly, they'll let anyone audit these days." Next, we'll have the cafeteria staff asking about differential topology. The room rippled with chuckles, a sound that coiled around her like barbed wire. A woman in a crimson scarf, her badge reading Yale. Associate professor leaned forward, her voice carrying, "She's probably chasing a certificate to hang in her cubicle." Pathetic, really. A man in a tweed jacket, his badge proclaiming him a department chair from Cornell, added, "She looks like she irons her own shirts. No wonder she's out of place." A woman in the third row, her badge reading Harvard assistant professor, chimed in, her tone sharp, "This is what happens when they open these events to the public. She's wasting our time." A man with a goatee, his badge marking him as a journal editor from Chicago, muttered, "She's probably a secretary who got lost. Look at those shoes, did she walk here from 1995? A woman in a tailored skirt, her badge reading Stanford postdoc, leaned toward her neighbor, "I bet she's a single mom who thinks this'll get her a promotion. Sad." A man in the fifth row, his badge reading Oxford senior lecturer, added, "She's clearly out of her depth. Why do they let these people in?" The postdoctoral researcher with the British accent smirked. "Maybe she's here for the free coffee. Someone tell her the staff room's downstairs." A woman in the back, her badge reading UCLA, professor, whispered, "She's got no business here. Look at her, she's practically invisible." A man in the seventh row, his badge reading Caltech researcher, chuckled. "What's next? The janitor solving string theory." A woman in a navy blazer, her badge reading Columbia professor, added, "She's a nobody trying to be a somebody." It's almost tragic. A man in the ninth row, his badge reading MIT, associate professor, muttered, "She's probably here to feel important for a day. Let's not humor her." A woman in a green blazer, her badge reading Berkeley postdoc, scoffed, "Look at that notebook, did she steal it from a thrift store?" A man in the 10th row, his badge reading Tokyo. Professor murmured, "She doesn't belong in this room. It's an insult to the field." A woman in the 11th row, her badge reading Sorbonne researcher, added, "She's probably here to impress someone. What a waste of space." A man in a gray suit, his badge reading Chicago, Dean whispered, "She's making a fool of herself. Someone stop this." A woman in the 12th row, her badge reading Toronto. Professor sneered, "She's probably a hobbyist who read half a textbook and thinks she's Ramanujan." A man in the 13th row, his badge reading ETH Zurich. Fellow muttered, "This is why we need stricter gatekeeping. She's a distraction." A woman in the 14th row, her badge reading Heidelberg postdoc, whispered, "She's got no credentials. Look at her, she's a nobody." The laughter swelled, a relentless wave that filled the hall, each barb a needle sinking deeper. Sarah's face remained still, her eyes fixed on the projector screen where equations glowed in sterile white light. She didn't flinch, didn't shrink, but her grip on her pencil tightened, the wood biting into her palm. Her stillness was a shield, a quiet defiance unnoticed by the crowd. A memory flickered Sarah, age 10, standing in her family's marble-floored hallway, watching her mother endure whispers at a charity gala. That blouse's last decade. Doesn't she know her place? Sarah had clenched her small fists, her resolve hardening, vowing never to bend under such cruelty. Professor Carlton Harrington stepped to the podium, his silver hair catching the spotlight, his presence silencing the room like a conductor raising a baton. A titan in algebraic geometry, his name graced journal covers, his lectures packed auditoriums from Boston to Berlin. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, his voice smooth as polished stone, carrying the weight of a man who knew his words, shaped minds. Today we probe the frontiers of modular forms, a domain not for the faint of intellect. His eyes flicked to Sarah, a fleeting sneer curling his lip. Or for those who lack the proper credentials. The audience tittered, the sound curling like smoke through the hall. A flash. Sarah, age 12, sitting at her family's kitchen table, her father guiding her through prime numbers, his hands trembling from illness but his eyes alight. Numbers don't care who you are, Sarah, he'd said. They only ask that you see them clearly. Harrington scrawled a derivation on the chalkboard, his movements precise, his chalk tapping a steady rhythm that echoed in the high-ceilinged room. Sarah followed each step, her mind slicing through the symbols with a clarity forged in years of solitary study. She'd taught herself algebra while her daughter wrestled with number theory on diner napkins during night shifts, her hands stained with coffee and ink. Her education was a patchwork books borrowed from public libraries, theorems pieced together in stolen hours, problems solved by lamplight in a cramped apartment. She'd pored over journals at 2 a.m. Her daughter's soft breathing, the only sound her fingers tracing equations as if they were a map to freedom. She'd solved problems on the backs of grocery lists in the margins of second-hand textbooks on scraps of paper tucked into her apron pocket. Her mind was a crucible where patterns became truths, where chaos became order. Now a discrepancy snagged her attention, a subtle flaw in his substitution, a crack in the edifice of his proof. It was small but fatal, the kind of error that could unravel a decade of research, sending ripples through the field. She raised her hand, tentative but steady, the motion drawing every eye. Harrington paused, his chalk hovering his brow, furrowing as if annoyed by an insect. Yes, he said, his tone dripping with condescension. The woman in the back. Sarah's voice was soft, clear, cutting through the room's hum like a blade through silk. Your substitution in line 3 assumes the function is continuous at that point. But the boundary conditions suggest otherwise, don't they? A beat of silence, then the room erupted in murmurs, head swiveling, eyes narrowing. Harrington's smile tightened, his eyes shrinking to slits. You work in facilities, I presume. The word facilities landed like a whip, and the audience laughed, a sharp, cruel sound that echoed off the oak-paneled walls. The woman in the crimson scarf whispered loudly. She probably Googled math last night and thinks she's Euler. The blazer-clad student snorted, muttering, "This is rich. Get her out of here." Harrington's voice grew colder, each word a honed blade. And you believe you found an error in my work? My research published in the Annals, vetted by peers at Cambridge, Princeton, and MIT. He leaned forward, his hands gripping the podium, his smile predatory. Tell me, what's your training? Community college? An online course, perhaps? Or are you one of those hobbyists who fancies themselves a scholar? The room roared with laughter, a sound that pressed against Sarah like a physical weight. The man in the tweed jacket hissed as she stood, "Know your place, sweetheart. This isn't your world." The woman with the diamond studs added, her voice syrupy with mock pity. Poor thing, she's embarrassing herself. Someone should escort her out before she cries. The Harvard professor joined in, her tone slicing, "This is a symposium, not a community center. She's wasting our time." The journal editor from Chicago muttered, "She's probably a secretary who got lost. Look at those shoes, did she walk here from 1995? The Stanford postdoc leaned toward her neighbor. "I bet she's a single mom who thinks this'll get her a promotion." Sad. The Oxford lecturer added, "She's clearly out of her depth. Why do they let these people in?" The Cambridge fellow smirked. "Maybe she's here for the free coffee. Someone tell her the staff room's downstairs." The UCLA professor whispered, "She's got no business here. Look at her, she's practically invisible." The Caltech researcher chuckled. What's next? The janitor solving string theory. The Columbia professor added, she's a nobody trying to be a somebody. It's almost tragic. The MIT associate professor muttered, she's probably here to feel important for a day. Let's not humor her. The Berkeley postdoc scoffed. Look at that notebook. Did she steal it from a thrift store? The Tokyo professor murmured, she doesn't belong in this room. It's an insult to the field. The Sorbonne researcher added, she's probably here to impress someone. What a waste of space. The Chicago dean whispered, she's making a fool of herself. Someone stop this. The Toronto professor sneered. She's probably a hobbyist who read half a textbook and thinks she's Ramanujan. The ETH Zurich fellow muttered, this is why we need stricter gatekeeping. She's a distraction. The Heidelberg postdoc whispered, she's got no credentials. Look at her, she's a nobody. The laughter swelled, a relentless wave that filled the hall, each barb a needle sinking deeper. Sarah stood, her movements deliberate, her flat silent on the polished floor. As she passed the front row, the tweed-jacketed man leaned back, smirking. This'll be quick. Back to cleaning by lunch, I bet. The woman with the diamond studs whispered, I almost feel bad for her. Almost. The blazer-clad student pulled out his phone, his fingers poised to record what he assumed would be a humiliation. Sarah's cardigan brushed the edge of a chair, the frayed fabric catching briefly a small rebellion against the polished world around her. The weight of their stares was heavy but familiar. She'd felt this before. Whispers at her mother's side, sneers at her father's funeral, glances in boardrooms she'd chosen to leave behind. Her family's wealth. The Mitchell legacy was a shadow she'd stepped out of, choosing a life of quiet purpose, raising her daughter alone, working night shifts to keep her independence. A memory flickered Sarah, age 20, standing in her family's mansion, staring at her father's portrait in the grand hallway. The painting captured his quiet intensity, his eyes seeming to follow her. She'd rejected the family's expectations, the galas, the boardrooms, choosing a life of her own making. Her mother had done the same, trading wealth for simplicity, enduring whispers for her faded dresses. Sarah had learned from them both her dignity, a flame that no scorn could extinguish. A flash. Sarah, age 16, standing in her father's study, his desk piled with journals, his voice soft but fierce. Numbers don't care who you are, Sarah. They only ask that you see them clearly. He'd been a reclusive mathematician, his work obscure but revered, his initials etched on the notebook she now carried. She'd inherited his mind, his fire, but not his name, not publicly. The chalk felt cool in her hand, its weight grounding her like an anchor. She faced the board, its expanse a blank canvas, and began to write. Her strokes were precise, unhurried, each symbol flowing into the next like a river finding its course. The room's laughter faded, replaced by a tense hush, the only sound the soft scratch of chalk on slate. She corrected the substitution, her hand moving with a certainty that belied her plain appearance. Then, in a move that felt as natural as breathing, she compressed 3 convoluted theoretical steps into a single elegant transformation, a solution so streamlined it seemed inevitable. She stepped back, chalk dust on her fingers, and turned to face the room. Her cardigan sleeve had slipped, revealing a wrist scarred from years of scrubbing dishes, a silent testament to her life beyond the lecture hall. Harrington stared, his face draining of color as he scanned her work, his lips parting slightly. No errors. The woman from Yale whispered, that's impossible. A man in the second row, his badge reading Stanford. Professor Emeritus adjusted his glasses, leaning forward to scrutinize the board. Dr. Evelyn Chen, a visiting professor from MIT, stood slowly, her eyes wide behind rimless glasses, her voice cutting through the stunned silence. That's the Takahashi transformation. Published last month in the International Journal of Mathematics. How did you know it? Sarah's voice was calm, almost distant, her hands clasped in front of her, the chalk dust smudging her cardigan. I just saw it. I've been studying on my own. Harrington cleared his throat, his voice strained, grasping for control. Well, anyone with advanced training might eventually stumble across it, Doctor. Chen cut him off, her tone sharp as a scalpel. No. They wouldn't. That transformation is a breakthrough. She just advanced the entire field in 10 minutes. The room exploded in whispers, heads craning to see Sarah, whose cardigan suddenly seemed less shabby, more like armor forged in quiet battles. The blazer-clad student lowered his phone, his smirk gone. The woman with the diamond studs fidgeted, her confidence fraying. The man in the tweed jacket stared at the floor. His bravado vanished. The Harvard professor who'd called Sarah a waste of time stared at the board, her pen still. The journal editor from Chicago shifted uncomfortably, his earlier words a noose around his neck. A flash. Sarah, age 22, sitting in a library, her daughter napping in a stroller, her fingers tracing theorems, ignoring the stares of students who assumed she was out of place. She'd taught herself calculus in that library. Her daughter's soft snores a metronome, her mind a refuge from the world's judgments. Another Sarah, age 27, standing in a hospital hallway, her daughter recovering from fever, her notebook open on a waiting room chair, equations a lifeline through fear. She'd solved a problem that night, her mind a sanctuary, her daughter's hand in hers. The symposium's venom was familiar and echo of those moments, but she'd learned to let it pass, to let her actions speak. The symposium chair, a wiry man with a nervous smile and a badge reading Crestwood Dean of Sciences, approached the podium, his hands fidgeting.
Ms.
Mitchell, perhaps you'd like to try this. He projected a new problem, one dubbed unsolvable in academic circles. Its complexity, a legend debated in journals, mocked on X-posts as a theoretical ceiling. The equation sprawled across the screen, a labyrinth of symbols that had stumped scholars for decades. The audience buzzed, skeptical but intrigued, their earlier scorn replaced by wary curiosity. Sarah studied the equation, her eyes tracing its contours, her mind not racing but dancing, weaving through patterns, shapes, connections forged in countless sleepless nights. She picked up the chalk again. Her hand moved, paused, moved again, constructing a solution that was original, breathtaking, a transformation never documented. She wrote with a quiet intensity, her cardigan sleeves slipping further, the scars on her wrist catching the light. The room watched breathless as she unraveled the problem's core, her solution unfolding like a flower in bloom. She wrote the final symbol, a quiet flourish, and stepped back. The silence was absolute, then shattered by applause, stunned reverent, a tidal wave of awe that filled the hall.
Doctor.
Chen approached, her voice urgent, almost pleading. Your notebooks. I need to see them. Apply to MIT. Immediately. Harrington. His face flushed with shame, muttered about reviewing her work, but his voice was drowned by the crowd's fervor. Sarah nodded, her expression unchanged, but as she returned to her seat, her fingers brushed the notebook, its embossed initials a tether to her father. A flash her mother years ago shamed for a faded blouse at a charity event, her head high despite the whispers. She's a Mitchell, but look at her dressed like a maid. Sarah had watched silent, her resolve hardening like steel. The room's energy shifted, the air thick with disbelief and admiration. The Oxford lecturer who'd questioned her presence clapped slowly, his face pale. The UCLA professor who'd called her invisible stared at the board, her earlier words a bitter echo. The symposium chair approached again, his voice trembling.
Miss
Mitchell, there's another problem, if you're willing. He projected a third equation, less famous but equally daunting its structure, a tangle of abstract constraints. The audience leaned forward, their skepticism replaced by anticipation. Sarah took the chalk, her movements steady, her mind already mapping the problem's contours. She wrote, her hand a blur of precision, her solution elegant, innovative, a bridge between known theory and uncharted territory. The room erupted again, applause mingling with gasps.
Doctor.
Chen shook her head, muttering, she's rewriting the canon. A man in the back, his badge reading Caltech senior fellow, stood clapping slowly, his face a mix of awe and disbelief. A fourth problem followed, then a fifth, a sixth, a seventh, each more obscure, each met with the same quiet intensity. Sarah's solutions piled up a monument to her unseen battles. The audience was no longer a pack of predators, but a congregation of witnesses, their earlier scorn replaced by reverence. The Columbia professor who'd called her a nobody scribbled notes furiously, her earlier words a ghost. The Stanford postdoc who'd sneered about single moms sat silent, her face flushed. The MIT associate professor who'd dismissed her as unimportant leaned forward, his notebook open, his earlier words a shadow. The Tokyo professor who'd called her an insult stared at the board, his earlier words a faint echo. Sarah returned to her seat, her cardigan now a symbol, her notebook a relic of her quiet triumphs. A flash. Sarah, age 18, standing at her father's grave, her mother's hand in hers, the whispers of mourners cutting deep. She's a Mitchell, but she'll never amount to anything. She'd vowed to prove them wrong, not with words but with action. Another Sarah, age 25, rejecting a diamond ring from a suitor who saw her as a trophy. Her voice cold. I'm not for display. She'd walked away, her notebook under her arm, her future unwritten. Another Sarah, age 29, sitting in a park, her daughter playing nearby, her notebook, open a passerby's glance, turning to a sneer. What's she writing, a grocery list? She'd kept writing her equations a shield. Another Sarah, age 33, standing in her diner's break room, her apron stained, her hands raw, her notebook open on a folding table. A coworker had laughed. What's that, your diary? She'd smiled, closing the book, her equations a secret world. The months that followed were a whirlwind. Sarah's solutions were dissected in journals, her name whispered in academic halls, her story, a quiet legend. X posts exploded with clips of her board work captioned, Unknown Woman Humiliates Math Elite. Invitations poured in, MIT, Stanford, Oxford, Cambridge, Tokyo, Paris, Sydney.
Dr.
Chen personally mentored her fellowship application, her eyes gleaming with respect. A journal editor, the same man who'd mocked her shoes, approached her at a conference, his voice halting.
Miss
Mitchell, I'd be honored to review your work. She nodded, her expression cool, her silence louder than words. The Caltech researcher who'd joked about string theory cited her work in his next paper, his earlier words a quiet regret. The Tokyo professor who'd called her an insult attended her lecture, his notebook open, his earlier words a faint echo. The Sorbonne researcher who'd called her a waste of space wrote a letter of apology, but Sarah left it unread. The blazer-clad student's fall was swift. His mockery, captured on video, went viral. His internship offer rescinded, his academic X profile flooded with criticism. He withdrew from the conference circuit, his name a cautionary tale. The woman with the diamond studs, a rising star at Princeton, faced whispers of her own, her colleagues deeming her unprofessional for joining the taunts, her latest paper rejected by a top journal. The man in the tweed jacket, a Cornell department chair, was sidelined, his reputation tarnished by a leaked video of his hissed insult, his graduate students abandoning his lab. The Harvard professor who'd called Sarah a waste of time saw her grant application denied, her peers citing character concerns. The journal editor from Chicago lost his position after colleagues questioned his judgment, his earlier words a stain he couldn't erase. The Stanford postdoc sent an email apology, but Sarah left it unread. The Oxford lecturer who'd questioned her presence attended her lecture, his notebook open, his earlier words a quiet regret. The UCLA professor who'd called her invisible wrote a review praising her contributions, her earlier scorn a shadow. The Columbia professor who'd called her a nobody cited her work in her next paper, her earlier words a ghost. The MIT associate professor who'd dismissed her as unimportant invited her to collaborate, his earlier words a faint memory. The Berkeley postdoc who'd mocked her notebook attended her seminar, her earlier words a quiet regret. The Tokyo professor who'd called her an insult published a paper referencing her work, his earlier words a shadow. The Chicago dean who'd called her a fool retired early, his earlier words a stain. The Toronto professor who'd likened her to a hobbyist sent a letter of apology, but Sarah left it unread. The ETH Zurich fellow who'd called for gatekeeping cited her work in his next lecture, his earlier words a faint echo. The Heidelberg postdoc who'd called her a nobody attended her talk, her earlier words a ghost. Harrington's fall was slower but deeper. His keynote invitations dwindled, his arrogance a stain in a field that prized humility. A rival scholar emboldened by Sarah's work revisited Harrington's older papers, uncovering a pattern of overstated claims. His latest grant was denied, his name fading from journal mastheads. He sent Sarah a letter carefully worded praising her contribution, but she left it unopened. A flash. Sarah, age 30, standing in her small apartment, her daughter asleep, her hands trembling as she solved a problem that had haunted her for months. She'd mailed her work to a journal under a pseudonym, fearing rejection. The acceptance letter framed on her wall was addressed to S. Mitchell. She'd kept it secret, her triumph private, her dignity intact. A memory. Sarah, age 27, standing in a hospital hallway, her daughter recovering from fever, her notebook open on a waiting room chair, equations a lifeline through fear. She'd solved a problem that night, her mind a refuge, her daughter's hand in hers. Another Sarah, age 35, standing in her apartment, the acceptance letter from the journal in her hand, her daughter's voice calling from the next room. She'd framed the letter not for pride, but as a reminder she'd built this herself. Another Sarah, age 31, sitting in a laundromat, her daughter reading nearby, her notebook, open equations, a quiet rebellion against the world's noise. A customer had sneered, "What's she doing homework?" She'd kept writing, her mind a fortress. Another Sarah, age 34, standing in her diner, her shift over her notebook tucked under her arm. A customer had left a tip, a note scribbled on a napkin, "You don't belong here." She'd kept the napkin not for anger but as fuel. Her life changed, but not her core. She moved through this world with the same quiet dignity, her cardigan traded for a simple blazer, her daughter's hand in hers. A year later, she stood at a podium, the lecture hall packed, scholars hanging on her words. She spoke of modular forms, but also of perseverance, of genius hidden in plain sight. "Never judge a mathematical mind by their clothes degree or day job," she said, her voice steady, resonant. "Geniuses hide in plain sight." The applause was deafening, but Sarah's eyes found her daughter's, a silent promise kept. 2 years later, she lectured at MIT, her daughter watching from the front row, her husband in the shadows, his pride silent but fierce. The Mitchell legacy, once hidden, was hers to redefine. The woman from Harvard attended one of her lectures, her face pale, her notebook empty. The Oxford lecturer cited her work in his earlier words, a quiet regret. The UCLA professor wrote a review praising her contributions, her earlier scorn a shadow. Sarah's daughter, now 10, carried her own notebook, her mother's initials etched on the cover, a new legacy beginning. Backstage, a man waited, his presence quiet but commanding. Her husband Daniel, a billionaire whose name carried weight in boardrooms, had watched her rise without interference, knowing she needed no rescue. His wealth was a shadow, she'd stepped out of, choosing her own path. A memory years ago, a late-night drive in his Bentley, the city lights blurring past, his voice low. "You don't need my world, Sarah. Yours is bigger." She'd smiled, her hand on her notebook open on her lap, equations spilling across the page. Now his smile was enough, a shared understanding that silenced the ghosts of that symposium. Those who had mocked her sent apologies, emails carefully worded, but Sarah didn't reply. Her work, her dignity spoke louder. A flash. Sarah alone in her apartment, standing before a mirror at midnight. Not primping, not despairing, but studying her reflection, ensuring she hadn't become someone else. The notebook lay open on the counter, its pages filled with equations, a map of her mind. She thought of her mother, shamed for her simplicity, her father dismissed as eccentric, their strength flowing through her. She thought of every quiet soul, judged, dismissed, forced to live under codes they didn't set. This story isn't just hers, it's theirs too. It's yours. If it stirred you, share it, talk about it, let it ripple outward. Subscribe to hear more stories of truth rising above the noise, of dignity, reclaimed, of genius, unveiled in the quiet places where it hides.